Good afternoon. This is Pat O'Connell, Chair of the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, calling to order a special open meeting on reliability. It's Monday, August 21st, 2023. A little late, but starting at 1 here. We have some folks in the room. There's quite a few people assembled online. And what we're here to talk about is inquiry and rulemaking pertaining to investor-owned utilities reliability metrics. So I haven't called it to order. I'll go ahead and call the roll. Commissioner Aguilera.
Present.
Commissioner Ellison.
Present.
And Commissioner O'Connell is present. So having, next item is consideration and approval of the agenda. Commissioners, did you have any changes you wanted to make to this agenda?
Mr. Chair, I would like to suggest that we move item number 8 just ahead of item number 7. So essentially that we switch places, item number 8 and item number 7 switch places. I think it could be helpful to discuss the Clayton outage before we start talking about the key reliability reporting issues.
Makes sense to me. Commissioner Aguilera, you got any?
Nothing additional.
Okay. So then I'll move that we proceed with an agenda with the Clayton outage presentation before the presentation by Mr. Ball.
Second.
It's seeing no dissension. I will let's move forward with that agenda as modified. All right, so we've had a couple workshops. They've worked out very well so far. And one of the secrets of it working out very well is once we get to this point, I turn it over to Commissioner Ellison. So I'm going to do that again. So the floor is yours, Commissioner.
I'm not so sure that's the secret, but well, I'd like to say I appreciate everyone's effort in this, and I'd like to ask Arthur O'Donnell if he has any comments before we begin.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellison, Commissioner Aguilera, and Chair O'Connell. Thank you very much for this opportunity. As we move to what is now the third informational workshop and special meeting on this topic of reliability, I'd like us all to keep in mind the very serious situations that are currently being faced to our west and to our east, with Tropical Storm Hillary hitting the California coastline yesterday afternoon. More than 60,000 utility customers from a variety of utility entities were without power for much of yesterday. The latest reports that I have is that utilities are working very hard on restoration efforts, and in San Diego gas and electric territory, they moved from several thousand customer outages down to about 400. This shows the commitment of our utility community towards resilience of their systems and restoring power. Meanwhile, to the east, Texas over the weekend issued 2 conservation alerts because of continued high temperatures and generation outages that have impacted operations in the ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and they have reported 10 new peak records this summer in Texas. Both of these events will be considered major event days in the world of reliability reporting, but that is not to underestimate the impacts that they have on customers, right? As impacts at a transmission level or wholesale level trickle down into the distribution level services. And our utilities are always prepared for dealing with these kind of events. And later on today, we'll be hearing about a particular serious outage in the town of Clayton, New Mexico, that was related to heavy winds. In the course of these workshops, you heard first what utilities currently do about reporting I'm not going to say mundane reliability, but they're everyday reliability statistics, right? Of numbers of outages that are experienced by customers, the duration of those outages, and how they relate to the utility decisions on investments into the distribution system in order to prevent future outages and reduce those numbers. During the last several weeks, the utilities have been meeting with each other and have made a presentation to commission staff on their common ground interest in a consistent platform for reporting reliability statistics and the outgrowths of things like worst performing circuits and the investments that are necessary to move circuits out of the worst performing category into a better position with reduced outages among them. And I'm pleased to say that there is a lot of common ground. And today, I think that you'll be hearing how the utilities have come together with a pretty well-designed package for what can be reported, what should be reported, how often it should be reported, and how the commission can monitor these statistics and metrics going forward. That's really all I have to say about it. Just to underscore the importance of reliability is one of the core functions of both utility service and for the Public Regulation Commission to provide enough resources to the utilities in order to maintain reliability, safety, and affordability of their utility services here in New Mexico. With that, on the agenda, it says back to the commissioners for any introductory remarks. So, and then off to Jason Ball, who's going to be moderating today's sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Appreciate those comments. I'd like to know if Commissioners Aguilera or O'Connell would like to make any remarks to start us off.
I'll just reiterate what I had said earlier, that this is the third workshop we've had so far. And from my perspective, I've learning a lot. And really heartened by what Art has teed up as a preview for what we should expect today. So looking forward to it, and let's get started.
Thank you. Yeah, just want to echo that sentiment. Want to thank the parties for getting together to discuss this, and looking forward to discuss what you all came up with. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased with the effort and the collaboration that our three investor-owned utilities have put into this. They did meet 5 times to discuss this matter and to formulate their proposed reporting template. Appreciate that they, on one of those meetings, they also met with Mr. Ball, Mr. Joe Edo, and our own Arthur O'Donnell to get additional feedback. I think we have a great start, and we have something that's very positive for us to discuss. So I appreciate that. I would like to hand it over to Mr. Ball to ask for any introductory remarks.
Thank you. My name is Jason Ball. I'm with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I'm an energy policy researcher. We're here just to provide technical and facilitation support to the New Mexico Commission as they investigate reliability. I've been very much enjoying my participation so far in all of this. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I really enjoy reliability metrics, which is not normal. But it's been very illuminating, understanding the specific characteristics of New Mexico and how reliability is impacted and affected by different events down here. So I'm been very much enjoying my participation, and I'm looking forward to a lively conversation today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ball. I'd like to say at the outset that I think it's probably best that P&M start out the discussion. I guess I should have expected 3 pretty much identical submissions, given that we asked for the utilities to come up with a single plan, and we also asked them to come up to make individual submissions. So I guess what we got what we asked for. But I do think, there are some utility specific issues, such as how they're defining their geographic territories that they propose to report on, and other similar issues. So, I'd like to ask Mr. Ball to moderate this part of it, and I think it's probably best that we start out with P&M.
Thank you for having us come up here. First, my name is Mark Fenton. I'm the Executive Director of Regulatory Policy and Case Management here at P&M. Let me just quickly introduce who we have with me. This is Wes Gray. Wes is our Director of Transmission, Distribution, and Substations at P&M. Omni Warner is our Director of Distribution Engineering. We also have in the audience with us Mike Mertz. He's our Vice President of New Mexico Operations and also our Chief Information Officer. And we have Justin Revord. Justin's a regulatory analyst working with me in the regulatory group. I thought, and I don't know if you want to introduce other utilities now or just wait till they get the opportunity, but we can.
I think we can wait till we.
Okay. I thought Mr. O'Donnell did an excellent job of covering what has happened over the last several weeks. I know I'm the person that asked Commissioner Ellison if we could have a little bit of time for all the utilities to work on this, and we have taken advantage of that. I won't repeat everything that you said or Mr. O'Donnell said, but that was great. It was actually an opportunity for all of the utilities to get together. We thought the last workshop in early July was excellent. And one of the things we did is we took the utilities, the technical folks got together, and we used as a template Mr. Edo's presentation. So we tried to incorporate a significant amount of what he put in the presentation into our joint recommendations. And then after we did that, after we had all those meetings, we thought, hey, it'd be a great opportunity to show this to Mr. Edo. We showed it to Mr. Ball. We showed it to Mr. O'Donnell, and we got some additional comments at that meeting that we've tried to incorporate. So with that, I would like to have Wes and the other utilities can chime in as appropriate as well, because this wasn't a P&M effort. This was all 3 utilities equally participated in this process. Do you have this? This is the exhibit A that was essentially attached. I've got extra copies if you don't, but we thought it'd be good for Wes just to kind of walk through what we've done here and answer any questions. Hopefully, I think is Patrick Rodriguez. He was going to try to put this on the screen too, so everybody could see it if possible. Yeah, there it is. Okay. Wes.
Okay, good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for allowing us to come and present this kind of joint finding amongst the utilities. There were numerous representatives from all 3 utilities on these calls, our technical experts, pulled together to try to come up with a common ground so that we're all conveying similar type of information for you to make decision-making on and understand what's going on the various systems. So I just kind of plow through and I'll ask if any of our the other utilities have any comments after each kind of main section. So the first section, pretty standard reliability metrics, which are the SAIDI, SAFI, and KD calculations. We talked about multiple ways of representing that data, but the biggest one is overall for the company, how are you doing as a whole? And then organized by a division or operating area. And I'll go into a little bit of specifics. For P&M, we tend to look at it by the main communities that we're serving in a particular area. So in Albuquerque, typically Valencia, Bernalillo, and Sandoval County are lumped into one. We consider that Metro Albuquerque because all those communities are so close together. That's just one kind of contiguous block. So we consider that kind of a metro division. In the south, we divvy it up because the communities are far enough apart that they're geographically isolated a little bit and have a little bit different issues related to terrain or vegetation types. So we break our southern area up into 4 operating districts. It's Silver City, Deming, Alamogordo, and Ruidoso. In the north, Santa Fe and the other 2 small communities we serve, which are Las Vegas and Clayton. Las Vegas and Clayton are pretty small and have a lot of similarities for the most part to Santa Fe. So northern tends to be aggregated more so in one. It's really about population. And even though they're a little more geographically isolated, we just kind of put them together as one kind of group. We talk about various outage causes, but one of them is distribution customers affected by transmission outages. And those happen quite regularly. And we're going to talk about one later in regards to the outage in Clayton. We were kind of back and forth because there were some recommendations of segregating customers of a distribution level customer and a transmission level customer. But from PNM's perspective, we have so few transmission connected customers. And because of their connection at that high voltage level, most are at least 115 kV or above, their reliability is really fairly solid. I mean, 99.999 is not uncommon for those customers. And so reporting those metrics are really not really talking about the system. It's really talking about the transmission system, and that's a fairly rigid system. It's in fairly good shape. So we really will just have distribution customers, but there is that impact of customers affected by transmission outages and what that does to the distribution SAIDI. So we're separating that kind of as a separate category. And then those main 3 metrics put together, including and excluding major event days. So you can see in aggregate what it is. And then for those major event days where we can exclude that day in the SAIDI calculation, SAIDI safety KD calculation, we can break that out and show just the impact of that one thing. So those outliers are excluded so that we're not, you can kind of get a sense of what's really going on day to day. And then you can see the outlier of main weather events or other things that might occur. There's some breakdowns into the formulation of what we're proposing to use for those calculations, both at an overall company level and at a divisional level. And then we just included a sample data table to kind of put it out there so you can kind of see what's going on. So any comments from the other 2 utilities on the main kind of 3 reliability metrics?
Y'all hear me okay, or do I need to turn this on? Okay, most people don't have a problem hearing me talk. So. All right. Yeah, the Zoom people might. Really just a couple of comments there. And I think Wes did a good job kind of outlining that. I think these are pretty standard reliability metrics across the country. I think these are kind of the.
I'm sorry, can you introduce yourself real quick?
Oh, sorry, apologies. Casey Meeks with SPS. Couple of comments on the division level data that we've discussed internally and as part of the working group. I think defining that as part of the upfront filing may be a bit of too much of detail. I think each utility needs to kind of define how divisions would best be described for each of us. And as is noted, we do have pretty unique situations across each of the utilities, but as far as the value of the data being broken down at a smaller level, I'm not sure, and not speaking for the other companies, I know at least from SPS's standpoint, we haven't looked at the data in enough detail at that granular level to really be able to determine if it is of value or if things like MEDs, right? If you have a storm that impacts one particular area but not the others, it's going to be a relatively small number of customers for that one division. So if you exclude that MED for that one division, it probably doesn't really have a big impact on the overall numbers. And so, you know, barring a little more investigation into that, I don't know that we can say today that there's a ton of value in separating out at that granular level. Now, I'll also mention that, you know, for us in El Paso, obviously, I wouldn't think the commission's too interested in Texas data. But, you know, if we want to do entire company, then obviously that would include the Texas data, which from an SPS perspective does include, you know, quite a few additional circuits and a lot of our reliability numbers might be driven by the Texas portion of the system. And so we could break that down into just New Mexico. It would be considered a division for us. So how we break that down, I guess, is the bottom line. I think it makes sense for each utility to just define that in the annual filing rather than us settling up front. But past that, no other comments for me.
So I have a question about that, and I think this P&M, feel free to answer the first, and then we'll hear from SPS. My question is, reliability data, or especially reliability reports, are not generally very accessible to normal people who don't deal with utilities on a regular basis. I'm wondering if there's a way in which you could present this information in a report card's not the right word, but some kind of just very discrete, short summary of reliability for different areas, and you could give that information to customers like once a year. Is that something that you have the ability to do?
We certainly could provide it to the customers through like a bill insert. Bill inserts are, you know, depends how big the bill insert is, but they cost anywhere from $30,000 to $210,000 to do a bill insert. We could, if we agreed on the information.
And one of the other things I've seen at other utilities I've been at is posting it out there on a website, building a portal page out there, which has some basic descriptions of the metric, what it's measuring, you know, in more layman's terms, and then having a requirement that you post it annually of what those numbers are, the same data we would provide in the filing, and then the customers have access to it. They can see where you're at. You can provide those yearly trends, and it's a pretty easy way of trying to communicate that out there to the general public.
So the reason I bring it up now is, do you think there might be value in having customers be able to see their specific division or their specific operating area in relationship to the overall company?
Divisionally, yes, and some of those small, mid-sized communities, they could see that information. You know, breaking down Metro into more granularity, it's not that we can't. I'd have to talk to my guys who are running the reporting to see what they can do to try to aggregate by like general area.
Yeah, today we file an annual report on April 30th, and it's part of a compliance filing. I kind of like the idea of providing something on the website for those that are interested. We could probably put something like in a Energy Works or one of our bill inserts that already go out there, so it wouldn't be incremental to notify the customers that we filed a report on April 30th. And by the way, if you're interested in your reliability data, it's on our website. Here's the website address, rather than send it to everybody, and because it's a pretty expensive endeavor to do these bill stuffers. So that's a good idea. We could probably put something in one of our normal bill stuffers that alerted them that reliability information was filed with the commission on April 30th. I know there's also been talk about having a workshop after we make that filing where we would make a presentation to the commission and to summarize the results from the previous year. So along that would be an opportunity to communicate with the customers, I think. I kind of like the idea, actually. SPS, if you have any comments, or I know El Paso Electric, I think is on Zoom, so I don't want them to be left out either.
Well, we can wait until they
present.
they present.
Okay.
At least they know I'll ask the question.
Yeah. Do you have anything on that?
Okay, the next section we talked about is providing you some trend data so you can kind of see where the overall trends of reliability are moving. We talked about it in our breakout with Mr. Wall, Mr. Edo, Mr. O'Donnell. We talked about that trending and trending really against yourself and having some measure of how you're doing. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Where you're trending? And so again, we've just included some samples that come out of some internal reporting we do at PNM. And in this case, we're breaking it out by SAIDI caused by transmission related outages, SAIDI from distribution related outages, and then overall totals, just informationally. We had multiple discussions regarding benchmarking. I just mentioned benchmarking against yourself. The three utilities, they benchmark against utilizing different data. PNM was participating in the Edison Electric Institute industry benchmarking. One of the other utilities is using the IEEE benchmark. It's just trying to find some comparison so that the commission would have something level set to be able to compare all three together versus each other and in a benchmarking. The general consensus is that comparing ourselves in the IEEE metric is probably the simplest. It's a publicly available info. And so it would just give us a way to level set the three utilities against each other and looking at benchmarking from that standpoint. The next piece is calculating the annual system availability index. And it's just what percentage of time is your system available for service? You know, how's your outages impacting you? And that's a pretty standard calculation. The next piece is looking at 5-year trends of your top 5 outage causes to see what causes are out there and, you know, how they're individually doing. So are they getting better or getting worse? So you can see if there is a particular issue out there on the system. Are you dealing with that particular issue and working toward resolving it to improve your reliability? And have you done something and all of a sudden you see the reliability for it drop off and hey, you've done really well. Is there something emergent coming out there that's moving to the top that, hey, there is an issue out there in your system you need to focus? But it gives you some trending of where the utilities are in regards to their biggest outage causes. The next piece is to look at worst performing feeders based on a SAIDI safety calculation. And there's some caveats to that. You know, it's SAIDI divided by SAIDI, and the screening criteria would be something greater than and equal to that value. And really it's over 300% of your SAIDI over safety. The threshold would be you'd look at a feeder only if it crept up there for 2 consecutive years. So a feeder impacted by a single weather event and may have a particularly bad reliability year may not repeat the next year, and that's not a real indication that you've got a problem. So it's a 2-year look in, so that you're looking at feeders that have particular issues on them that need to be resolved. And then feeders with a minimum of 10 customers, just trying to provide something of value. Those small feeders that have individual customers may not provide too much value. And in that here below is a little bit of breakdown of how we got there. Some of it really it's similar to reporting that the 2 utilities that have footprints in Texas, El Paso and Southwest in public service, do for the Public Utility Commission of Texas. So that's where this SAIDI over safety and at 300% of that, where it comes from. It comes out of their other reliability reporting. We're just trying to be consistent of what we're doing industry wide, and that we can come down to a common value for all 3 utilities. As part of that, when we talk about, we also want to include improvements that were done to those worst performers, what we're doing to them to try to affect their reliability, try to improve it as we go forward, and how it impacted it. Was it level? Did it improve? Did it reduce it. How much we had spent over the past years on improvements to feeders for reliability focused work, veg management, system reinforcement work, some of the programmatic things, pole test and treat, et cetera, that you're doing to try to improve your reliability and how much you're spending. And then one of the comments that came out of our joint session was a discussion about how many feeders are above that threshold mark that we really need to kind of focus on, and how many of them are falling below. And I think one of the comments that was put in there was that, well, if all your feeders are below the threshold, then you're done, right? And we're never done. Well, you know, operations side of the business, we run a marathon. We're not running a sprint, but you need to know where your feeders are. And if we're seeing consistently all feeders fall below that threshold, then maybe it's something we need to take a look at the threshold and make an adjustment to the threshold, so that we're getting relevant data to gauge our reliability.
Mr. Gray, I have a question.
Certainly.
So what was then, did you look into that? Like what percentage would have fewer than 10 customers? And then another question is, where did that threshold of 10 customers come from? Was there any precedent that you used?
For us at PNM, we have very few feeders that have less than 10 customers. I can't tell you the number off the top of my head, but I know it's pretty low. I don't know if it's really not common in our system to have that few a number. In other systems, it may be. I may ask for some help from our partners at El Paso and SPS if
mathematically they can skew the math too, right? So if you have a dedicated feeder with one customer and then that plays in to the averaging, that'll get skewed. And so that's part of it.
Yeah.
In our existing reporting system, we've used the 10 customer per count. That's been there as a legacy for quite some time. Most of them that don't have 10 customers, they're just like a single dedicated feeder. So we could give you the exact number. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
I had a similar question, and it wasn't just what Commissioner Aguilera asked, but who is this single customer at the end of the line? I mean, a feeder got built for one customer for a reason. What was that reason?
For us, typically it's a load. It's a specific load that large industrial type customer who would have a dedicated feeder to them.
I guess where I'm going with that, if that's like the regional medical center or something, then that one customer matters to more than one customer.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any
We don't have any hospitals like that.
feeder. Yeah.
We could, like Commissioner, we could pull the list and go through it. It's just hard to do that right now off the top of my head.
And provide you breakdowns. And then with that, that threshold and calculation, we included a citation out of the substantive rules of the Public Utility Commission of Texas. So that's where it comes out of. We just gave you the specific citation that our Texas utilities are using in their reporting to the PUCT. And then again, sample data tables of the information, what it potentially could look like. The next piece is the calculation for major event days, the threshold number, and did you have any major events for the previous year, just so you know what's going on out there on the system. So then also include in that metric the top 5 non-MED events based on their SAIDI value. You know, what kind of impact did they have? So you can see the major event day outages, and then you can also see other major outages out there that may have just fallen short of that. But you know, what was the cause, what we found, and some narrative on each one of what the resolution needed to be, and just some more detailed information about why the outages took as long as they did. The next piece that there was an interest in is providing CELA numbers for a 12 and 24-hour threshold, just to provide some data on customers that might be experiencing those long duration interruptions. and some of the causes for those. Utilizing the information from the IEEE 1366 standard as the basis of what the reporting would look like, but it's customers experiencing, number of customers experiencing 12 or 24 hours or more of outage duration, the number of customers impacted by that in a percentage, and really only reporting on individual outages. The viewpoint being is that 12 1-hour outages and 1 12-hour outages are two entirely different things. You may have a feeder that gets impacted by weather events or other things that are causing those outages, those smaller outages, and then you have one major event come through, and that's really what's going to drive that long duration outage. So they're kind of two different things. So the preference is to report those individual big long outages, and then why. What was the cause and what was the resolution for those? We talked a little bit about on the other one, but it's also really to include a report and talk about the programmatic work that we're doing, doing that vegetation management, doing those system maintenance, system reinforcement work, and then other long-term programmatic work that utilities are doing to try to maintain and improve the reliability on their individual circuits that are out there, including spending and how that impacted the reliability on those circuits. Did you have a worse performer and did it drop off? What did you see in gains as far as safety, Katie on those feeders based on that work? And then, much like we did earlier in the year, have a workshop where we could come in, and after the reporting period, we could come in and sit down with commissioners and talk through in more detail and answer more specific questions about what we're doing based on reliability. And at the tail end of our discussions, there were a few things that we all agreed on, that it would be good to have a workshop or workshops on to talk through how we want to use outage cause codes. We all three use slightly different systems to measure outage cause. We're really trying to standardize on the IEEE 1782 standard of causes listed just below the note there. It's really equipment related, lightning, planned outages, a loss of power supply caused by the public, vegetation related, weather other than lightning related, wildlife, an unknown cause, and other, and there may be other things that don't really fall into those, would fall into another, and an unknown, and I get this question quite a bit. You've got a lineman, he goes out there, it tripped out for some reason, and they patrol it, and they cannot find a legitimate cause for it. There's nothing obvious out there that they can say that definitively this caused the outage. And we don't want to mischaracterize something and just speculate. We want them to really commit to what they found. Weather is one that's probably, you can probably assume that, it's a lightning storm. It's been lightning and the feeder trips out. Okay, you probably assume it might be lightning, but you have outages in all weather conditions, day and night. And so there's that unknown category in there. For most of us, at PNM, we actually have far more granularity in some of the data we report. And so for us, it would just be rolling up some of those categories. So we break down equipment failures by transformers or cable or other causes, and we would just roll up to that equipment category just to provide, again, a level set platform for the commissioners to review data. And then if there was a need, we can provide them more granularity on our side. One of the things we talked about is including some sub-cause codes, especially during extreme events. If you've got extreme weather and you've seen a microburst or microcell go through, extreme heat, just various things, but to provide maybe a little more context to the individual outages of what the cause might be. And we debated whether or not we were going to include a planned or a scheduled outage where you're working with a customer to take an outage at a time convenient to them to do something, replace or upgrade a piece of a transformer, a piece of equipment out there. Ordinarily, that's not really an effector because for us, you're scheduling something with them, you're working around a schedule. And so if you're doing it in the middle of the night, it may take a little longer. So the outage may be longer. And how does that really impact your reliability, especially with something that's scheduled? In the end, we had the discussion with Mr. Edo, and he's like, put everything in there. Be upfront, be transparent with it. Those are part of your operating scheme that you have out there. And so include them. And it's something that you can fluctuate, you can turn off and turn on, but at least you know all of the outages that are impacting the customers that are out there. And then if there is any methodology that individual utilities have about classifying outages, again, talked a little bit specific about PNM. We have in our outage management system data that is far more granular, and we would roll it up to these specific categories. And part of the discussion of why we're talking about a workshop is, are there things that the commission would like to see that would add more definition to some of these outage cause codes and what you want to see and what the impacts would be to try to provide that. And then there was some discussion about the current PRC Rule 560 and doing outage reporting and the various causes that would facilitate and force a utility to do some reporting. And one is item A3 below. A customer that is at least 1 megawatt, probably at the time when the rule was put in place, a 1 megawatt customer might be a really large customer on the system. Well, with the demands on the system right now, 1 megawatt, you can have a supermarket that is a 1 megawatt load. And do you really want that type of reporting at that level of granularity? So, is it time to talk about that type and potentially revise that rule and have a discussion about it, about the impacts of reporting? But as we see more demand of the electric system come on and loads growing, that may force more reporting, and just not sure of what the intent might be, of what value that would provide the commission.
That would take a modification of Rule 560, which I don't think is part of the scope here. The other thing that we do informally now is we contact the commissioners if there's anything that we think rises to a level that it's going to hit the media, or your consumer relations division is going to get a lot of calls about. Like we had some balloon fiesta incidents in the past. I'll always call the commissioners, always do it individually so we don't end up with a rolling quorum, but I'll either call you or we'll notify you through an email. So, but Rule 560, I know the other utilities will probably have more to say on that than we do. We are reporting, that provision number 2, substantially all of a New Mexico municipality. That was the reporting we did for Clayton that triggered the next presentation we're going to do later. But we would also like to just see the value of 560, and that's why we're suggesting the workshop. I don't know inside the commission how much value you get from those reports. I know the Clayton one rose because it was an entire municipality was out of service, but some of the other ones, we don't get a lot of feedback on it, but we thought it would merit a workshop and a discussion. I think that concludes our presentation on the joint recommendation.
Well, thank you very much for being the first ones up here and going through all of it. I have some questions, but I will first let the commissioners ask any questions they might have.
Thank you for that presentation. Just a couple of things. For the CLID, the customers experiencing the long duration interruptions, you recommended 12 and 24 hours. What are your thoughts about also having 4 and 8 hours? Would that be much of a burden to report that additional information? Would it be helpful to have that information?
I don't think it would be difficult to pull those together and compile the information just from our outage management piece. The challenge we face operationally, and we see it system wide, is let's say we have a car pole incident. And we had one here a few weeks back that happened in Albuquerque, and the outage was 12 hours, but half that time we weren't even allowed to even access the site because it was a fatality. And so there's things outside of our control that we don't actually have control of those scenes. So yeah, those customers that were impacted, and we tried to work around the scene itself to isolate as many customers as possible. But there was a small number of customers, I want to say it was 15, that were out for that full 12-hour cycle. But 6 of that, we weren't even allowed to get in there because of the police, the emergency management folks managing that site. So we could definitely report that at a 4, 8, 12, 24 kind of cycle. It's just, there's some things that's why some of the causes and some of the narratives are going to be important, so you can kind of understand the context too of why the outage was as long as it was.
I appreciate that. In terms of the worst performing feeders, you've got the 300% over the SAIDI divided by safety. Is that right? This KD
Yes.
measurement. So would that be part of the worst performing feeders, or would that be sort of a separate category by itself?
What we're proposing is that be the screening criteria of what is really a worst performing feeder, is that SAIDI over safety value, really looking at it being 300% of your SAIDI value on your system. So you've got some feeders that really are not performing very well. And it's just to try to really identify the ones that are really underperforming.
So instead of saying your worst performing 10% or your worst performing 20 feeders, you're proposing a different standard here. Is that correct?
Yes. And it's to be in line with the Texas utilities, what they're reporting now to PUCT. And for us, I think traditionally we've reported, I think, a top 10 list. And it kind of depends on the feeder. Some feeders may make your top 10 list, but are really not underperforming. And so it's to set a screening criteria to really identify feeders that are really not performing very well at all.
Great, thank you. That's helpful. But I understand you're not proposing, what Texas has, this strict requirement that a feeder should not have more than 300% of the system average for the SAIDI. Is that correct? This is just for reporting, whereas Texas seems to take it a step further. Am I correct in my understanding of that?
I can chime in.
Yeah.
Casey makes again. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by taking it a step further. Texas does have actually a penalty matrix associated with those worst performing feeders, and no, we would not be suggesting that. As far as the a couple things there on that 300%, obviously it's just a statistical analysis of the overall system efforts. I mean, if it needs to be 250, if it needs to be 350, there's going to be a threshold there. But I think the important part, at least in my mind, is defining what is bad, right? If you just pick a percentage of your system, if you just pick a count of your feeders, all of those feeders could be theoretically performing very well. You're still going to have the 10 that are the worst, right? And so it removes the perspective from the reporting. Whereas if you have some definition of what is bad, then it lets us understand, where we need to focus our time and attention, our dollars ultimately on those feeders.
Thank you.
Thanks, P and M. I have a couple of questions about this, but they are also, some of them might be better directed to the other utilities, so feel free to just ask me to ask them. The first question I have is, and we kind of brought this up a little earlier, is hospitals. They're kind of critical service customer where you can't really have them be interrupted ever. And generally when they do experience some kind of power interruptions, their first priority for restoration. That's not discussed anywhere in here. And so I'm curious, what kind of information do you think it would be useful for the commission to have in terms of reporting about how customers or how critical care customers are interrupted, what interruptions they're experiencing, that kind of thing?
We file with the commission a curtailment plan. I think that's included, isn't it? I think we file a curtailment plan with the commission that identifies how we would curtail customers and what the level of priority is. I think on an annual basis.
Yeah.
You might be more familiar with it.
Yeah, so, we identify those critical customers, and those are the ones, if we had to curtail in any way, shape, or form, for whatever reason, those are ones that are gonna get maybe not curtailed and try to provide that service. That's something we really don't want to do. We're looking at those critical facilities and have an eye on what can we do to not impact their function in the community. Anecdotally, we've worked with several of them to provide, they have a little bit different class of service under us. They have auto transfer switches, so their load is transferable between two different circuits. So if they see an outage, it'll try to transfer to the alternate feed and keep them in reliability. Most of the larger facilities, especially ones with larger critical care and larger emergency room facilities, have their own backup systems to provide a tertiary backup as well, so that they have some power. We had some issues in 22 in Ruidoso, and at the time when the system went down, Sierra Blanca Medical Center was on their backup generators, and that they continue to provide their critical care. So it just kind of depends on where they are in the community and what they're doing as to what their reliability level can be. But there are numerous of the larger facilities in Albuquerque specific that have auto transfer service between two feeders. So we've been working with them for a number of years to make sure that they have what they need to be able to continue to operate because of what they have, their role in the community.
Do you have like internal company definitions or anything for what constitutes critical service customers? Or is it a specific tariff that you direct them to?
I'm not sure there's a specific tariff.
I don't think there is.
Okay. I'm just curious, because trying to figure out how to get some information related to that might be relevant for reporting purposes. It's useful to know where the lines are.
For some of those facilities, for us, it's going to be housed in our GIS. That's where we're going to know where those transfer switches are.
Yeah, I mean, we work with our customer service team to actually flag customers in our system that are critical customers. So it's what you would imagine, right? The hospitals, sewer treatment, so infrastructure that's critical for society. So those are flagged in our system. The point, though, that Wes brings up is if we just report on the feeder outage, which we get that report. So if you have a feeder outage, here's the customers that are critical customers on that feeder that are, they may not be out though. So they may have been primarily served their primary source from that feeder, but they may have transferred to another source. So we could go through logic to determine that, to say, did they actually go into a power outage or did they transfer to the other source? There's another level of logic we would have to go into to kind of unravel to truly report that out. I think the point you're bringing up too, though, is if we built the definition, is it the same definition that we've all agreed on? So all of that's just data that we tag customers by. So if we had a common agreement we would just create that tag inside of our system.
It's generally through things like self-nomination, right? Where a customer you'd be working with a specific customer saying, and that's how you would decide those tags.
Yeah. Either with the customer, or we work directly with like our customer service group to identify their need. And then the criticality of it. The primary focus that we've used that back on our side is when we've developed our load shedding, should we need to load shed circuits, which circuits would be lower on our prioritization or we wouldn't. So that was one of the focuses on why we have that list built.
I do have one other question that's, I think, relevant for right now, which is obviously there's a lot going on in this industry right now, and a lot of what is going on is pushing towards electrification, which is causing increasing loads, increasing duration of loads. For instance, you've got more electricity usage at night, maybe because of EVs, which can overheat transformers. And I'm curious whether you are tracking that kind of thing, or if you have ways of looking at outages that are caused by overloading, or that are caused by long duration load that wasn't ever planned for that circuit or for that transformer.
At this point, specific tracking, no, we do not have. P&M has interest in deploying better technology in an AMI system to give us more granular data at that level. Right now, we're using either electromechanical or just basic solid state metering to capture kilowatt hours and kilowatt demand.
And we have a pending application in front of the commission on our AMI, so we won't want to go into too much detail on that.
Avoid AMI. Okay.
At the feeder level, we see it, and we track in outage management some granularity. So our linemen have the ability to come in, and what my team sees on the operations side of the business are transformer failures, typically due to overload, or there is actually a category. If they go out there and the transformer is still in, but customer is seeing fluctuating voltage or some other something that they can measure, they'll check current, they'll figure out what the load is, and then they'll say, okay, this transformer is overloaded. Hey, it's something we need to address. And so those emergent problems get moved out and moved over to the restoration side. So those guys are out there repairing that work. So we're tracking it in outage management currently, but as far as what it specifically is, technology is definitely going to help us have better data.
I have a question about the regions or operational areas that we were discussing at the beginning of your presentation. Are you proposing that the utility define what that area should be, or should the commission offer that flexibility, right, but prescribes certain parameters as to how the region should be defined?
I think our preference is to allow us to define them, because there's, for P&M, really our organizational structure is really set up to operate in those individual quote unquote divisions. And so that's how we track the reliability. So that organizational structure, those crews that are there, that's what we're measuring those guys by. So we know how they're responding. We wouldn't object it for input of how we could characterize it. If we need more granularity in a particular area than other, it may make sense for us to split those areas out separately. But realistically, right now, it's grouped by the working groups that are actually dealing with it. So they see the reliability from their operating area, and that's how it's organized right now in our outage management.
Thank you.
And just to clarify, would Las Vegas and Clayton be lumped together? Is that how you're currently doing it?
Correct.
But would Santa Fe, Albuquerque area, would that all be considered one
No,
area?
the Albuquerque Metro is really Valencia, Bernalillo, and Sandoval counties. So it stops at the northern Sandoval County line. Everything north of that is considered part of the Santa Fe division for us.
So you would combine Santa Fe, Las Vegas, and Clayton?
Yes. That's how it's currently organized
I
because that
see.
is one operating group.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, PNM. I will ask that SPS come down and sits in the hot chair.
Good afternoon, commissioners and Jason, nice to meet you. My name is Mike D'Antonio. I'm with SPS, and with me today, Aaron Moore at the end of the table and Casey Meeks. We don't have any formal presentation this afternoon. We did participate in the 5 meetings with the other utilities. We were part of the devising of that template that you saw on the screen, but we're here to answer questions. I think would be probably the best use of the commission's time. So I will just turn it over to you all and turn it over to our team.
Thank you. That works perfectly. So can you start by just going over your specific operating areas? We heard about how PNM divides their system up in their OMS and how they are proposing to divide it up here. I'm curious what your system looks like.
Yep, sure thing. So speaking specifically to the New Mexico side, we have the way that we would define divisions is basically our service center, service territory. So where we have, a congregation of crew members and folks that can work on the system. So Lee County is one location. Eddy County is a second. When we're talking about division level, if we were to start looking at reliability metrics, we would probably focus on that area holistically as kind of southeastern New Mexico, our oil patch area. But we can split it in those 2 towns that there are 2 different service centers in both of those locations. And then we have Roswell, which also includes some of the outlying towns, Dexter, Hagerman, a few Artesia, all served out of the Roswell service area, which is kind of central to our portion of New Mexico. And then Clovis, Portales, and Tucumcari are all the northern part of our service footprint.
So you heard some of my questions earlier. I will give you an opportunity to answer for yourselves any of the questions that you've already heard asked that you might have had some comments rolling around in your head when it was happening.
Yeah, sure thing. So I do think I have a handful of comments, just starting from the top of the exhibit that you all were provided. We talked about the division level. I mean, we do have access to that data. I think it's just a matter of how much data do we want to include in a report and what value can we derive from it. Again, I think as I mentioned, it depends on how many customers we have in some of those areas. If we look at like the oil patch area, how do we define a customer? A lot of those oil patch customers have primary meter service. So there's a lot of load, a lot of individual locations behind one primary meter, but for us, that's one customer. So it doesn't necessarily give, as accurate a view into the world, maybe as you might think, or it might be suggested as just a reporting line item. So I do think looking at it probably for New Mexico as a whole, definitely valuable. Where you break it down and how you break it down from there, I think is probably an ongoing discussion we just need to have after we pull some additional data. See, meter level data. I think there was maybe a question or a little bit of discussion about that. It does. I think where it came up was whether or not we can provide a customer some sort of information about how their performance is with regard to the rest of the system. I do think AMIs, as has been mentioned by the PNM folks, AMI will have a big impact into the availability of what we can provide to customers. today, we can look at individual customer outages depending on how accurately our system's connected from a GIS perspective. There's a lot of variables that could potentially go in there that would make that data, again, maybe not as valuable to that customer as it could be. Once we get AMI connectivity and we have that individual customer meter data, then I think it would be very easy to do something like just provide information on their customer portal that would show them dates, times, durations of outages specific to their area. And then maybe we could provide some perspective, ideally electronically. I mean, I think the billing inserts are kind of a waste of time for most people. They go in the trash with the envelope. So I do think, moving towards that direction in the future might be something of value where customers can see, here's my performance as compared directly to my town and, whatever that division definition is. Something along those lines, I think could be of value to customers. Moving down the IEEE benchmark, and I will say the SPS, probably was well, I guess I'll say I directly disagreed with Mr. Ito's perspective on that. He didn't see a whole lot of value in providing that industry-wide data, and I can definitely understand that perspective. But from our end, being that there's only 3 investor-owned utilities in New Mexico, I do think it gives the commission and anybody that would look at the report some perspective outside of New Mexico. And it kind of comes back to what I mentioned on the 10 worst feeders, right? If you don't have a definition of what is good, it's hard to know where you stand. And so by providing IEEE data, there's a lot of different geographically dispersed utilities across that reporting. So a lot of that, a lot of the differences between utilities are somewhat built into that report. And you could pick out individual utilities and compare and contrast, but looking across that as a data set and determining where we all would sit as investor-owned utilities in the state of New Mexico against our peers across the entire US, I think provides good perspective, and it's easy enough to provide. We don't even have to be a member of IEEE. I think PNM's concern is they don't submit reporting for that particular metric, but based on SAIDI data, you can just slot yourself right in there. So I think it makes sense to do that. Again, if it's just for perspective, to me, it makes sense to have that provided. I think we talked about the worst performing feeders, and maybe a couple of things to mention there as far as the Texas reporting being a penalty-based metric. It's very difficult just because of the weather being a primary factor for outage cause, particularly in some of our geographically dispersed areas, low customer counts, but a lot of line miles of exposure. We do have feeders on there that show up on the list year after year. The difficulty for our standpoint is how much do you invest in a line such as that, that's very long geographic line, but very few customers, before you need to define a threshold, right? A lot of our rural customers are tolerant to outages more so than an urban customer, particularly commercial or industrial type customer. And so when we're talking about, do you invest your money in the right places at the right time? I think that's where this conversation needs to be driven by what is considered a poor performing feeder, and then some perspective around how the rest of your feeders relate to that with regard to the customer types, the reason why you might be spending money elsewhere aside from those that hit the threshold. So I think defining that threshold is very important. Having some commentary, which I think we mentioned in the exhibit, but providing some commentary around that as well is an important part of this that I think would be valuable for everybody at the table. The 10 customers, I think that was a question, why 10? Mathematically, when you get below 10, it's a fairly short duration outage that would force that feeder to meet the threshold. And so that some of the other metrics that we have included in here may be of more value for that particular situation. So let's just say a feeder with 5 customers on it. Maybe you would want to look at things like CME, how many times were they out? What was the duration of their outage? Some other metrics that we also propose to include in here that I think would be a better view of those type feeders than including them on the 10 worst performing feeders or the top worst performing feeders. CLID 4 and 8, I think I agreed with P&M that we could definitely provide that information. I also don't know that there's a ton of value there. Again, looking at our geographic footprint, Southeast New Mexico is a specific situation. Our first responders actually take their work vehicle home. If there is an outage, middle of the night, they respond, they're on call, they respond straight from their house to the location. It could potentially take an hour to an hour and a half just to get to the location of the outage. From that point, they start patrolling the feeder line. Today, it's very manual. We don't have the tools and the visibility from an automation perspective on the system to be able to send them to a potential fault location today. Again, that's part of our advanced grid proposal and something that we would be looking to continue to build out over the course of the next decade or so. But without that information, they start at the outage and they start working their way up a very rural feeder. Oftentimes in the oil field, that's, following lease roads, potentially going across country on the right of way. It may take hours for them to even find the reason for the fault. Once they find the fault, now we've got to call a crew potentially for a larger issue, a pole down, something like that. Then you mobilize the crew and get them there. So again, it's balancing costs, it's balancing labor requirements, it's balancing availability of people, for the next day's work. That I think makes the shorter thresholds a little less informative. If we're looking at general performance of the system, I think those things start to come into play there, and there's a lot more of that, at least in our situation, maybe than would be, than people would realize. Planned outages, as far as including that in the definitions, I think it makes sense to do so. A couple of things that I might mention there that were different than what Wes and others mentioned. There's definitely a safety aspect to line work as well. That's another place where, as the operation side of the utility, we need to balance our workers' safety as they're out doing a particular job with what the customer's requirements or perceived requirements are. And there will be times where, for the safety of our folks, it's better to de-energize a portion of line so that they can do the work that they need to do, right? And while at times our customers may not understand that, it is the right thing to do for our employees. And so, we try to give them notice. I think the industry at large is trending more towards a view of safety where you identify critical risks on the system and you try to mitigate those. And one of the ways to mitigate, obviously, one of the major hazards is to de-energize the line, right? And so the industry is moving a little more towards that as being a question of why don't you de-energize rather than why do you de-energize? And I think that's something that if we trend it over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, we will definitely start seeing more planned outages because of that safety aspect than maybe we've seen in the past. So I wanted to mention that. Rule 560, as has been mentioned, the availability of that data from a load perspective is a little hard to come by without having meter level real-time data. The definition of some of the requirements there. So when you're talking either 0.1, I think was the 100 megawatts or 10%, but what is that 100 megawatt loss? Is that of daily peak? Is it average peak? Is it that instantaneous peak where you lose? Our system varies quite a bit, and again, being Southeast New Mexico, we have a huge amount of load in the industrialized part of the oil field. Even 100 megawatts wouldn't necessarily be something that would be noteworthy, depending on the reasons for it. I mean, we've got substations that are loaded up to 50 megawatts right now for individual substation with a couple of feeders out of it. Individual customer primary meters that are 10 plus megawatts, right? So that could be a customer caused outage where we only see it at the meter level, right? They've got a primary system past our primary meter. It's an issue on their system that caused the outage. We just see it as an outage. We don't know it's customer caused until we get out there and do some investigation, right? And so there's all these nuances to that rule that would maybe be questionable, in my opinion. 1 megawatt, it definitely doesn't seem to be reasonable or valuable to me. and depends on how you define, again, is that point of time? How do you define when you would report that 1 megawatt loss? Is it that customer's load at the time? Is it their average customer load? So there's a lot of things there that I think would warrant some additional discussion. I think, Mr. Ball, you asked hospitals, similar to what P&M mentioned, many of our larger regional facilities, larger hospitals do have dual feeds. Oftentimes for our system, that's on separate feeders, separate substations. So that there is a little natural redundancy built into that situation. And then most of those larger hospitals also have on-site either generation or even, battery backup for some of their critical facilities inside the hospital. So I think we're in a pretty good spot there from a system perspective. And I don't think we report a whole lot of that. Again, it's just the nature of what we do. We do pay attention to our critical loads. I'd actually asked one of our control room leaders, how we define or what entity defines our critical infrastructure, because we do as well keep a list for load shed purposes. We review that list a couple of times a year. Anytime we build out to new customers, build new feeders, new substations, we take another look at it and make sure that our load shed list is situated. We work with our managed accounts group on some of our large customers that, may not necessarily be defined from a governmental perspective as critical, but for that individual customer, they do have critical processes. So think a refinery where if they were to shut down, it would cost them a ton of time and money to get their particular processes situated where they could start back up. And so, critical customer list is maintained. We do in outage events prioritize our restoration to some extent by those critical customers. Depending on the outage event, it could change time to time though. I think last time we were here in person, we had the Perryton tornado. As a good example there, gas stations became critical infrastructure at that point, right? If you can't get fuel for all of the different first responders and utility folks that were there, then it becomes a bit of a challenge to deal with the other issues that we need to deal with. And so we pay attention to it. We try to prioritize based on, where those folks are on our system. Electrification impacts. Aaron, I might actually turn it over to you just a little bit, talk about transformers and.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about, I think you asked some questions about transformer data and whether we could do predictive analysis on transformers. Well, number one, Aaron Moria, manager planning performance on the Excel side. And we do have a robust amount of data around that. We haven't gotten to a point, kind of back to AMI, I think it could provide a ton of value. We do trend things like failed transformers, outages due to failed transformers, and then try to trend that back to attached customers, data that we do have in place, average customer load based on that. Was that a residential customer? Were those commercial customers? We brought demand data in, though it's not always real conducive back to kind of some of what Casey's talking about to understand failure. But we have attempted that. I'll just say, I think, in advanced grid, I think we'll be able to do that much more. But we have made some attempts there. Trying to think of any other electrification you see in mind.
Well, just system loading in general, we have looked at with the data that's available to us today, potentially where we might see heavier EV penetration and what the condition of our system, the age of our system in those areas are back, secondary system, which is something we haven't really been all that concerned with. We deal with it when we have outages, but it's something that we're starting to look at a little harder. Do we need to upgrade secondary? Do we need to upgrade transformers in certain subdivisions, certain geographic areas where EV penetration might be a little more prone to take off? So again, we're looking at it. We understand that the grid in general is going that direction, and it's something that we need to be prepared for. But having the capabilities on the system to have more real-time data is going to be extremely valuable to us. And I think that was all the questions that I remember being asked, but happy to entertain others.
Commissioners, do you have any questions?
One question, I guess, about the benchmarking, certainly system level performance is going to depend a lot on your particular geography, I mean, clearly, performance is going to be worse in heavily forested areas than in plains. And, I think we know that, because of that, our New Mexico utilities are going to compare favorably to industry averages. So, I guess I'm wondering, is there something that is better that we could propose? Maybe looking at your own utility over, say, like a 10-year period, comparing with yourself over a 10-year period.
So I do think we included some 5-year trending as part of our proposal. If we wanted to extend that on 5 years, I don't think it would be much of a problem. With the only caveat that, again, things like AMI, other system changes that may occur over a decade period might have step changes to the data that would have to be explained. And again, I mean, as far as the industry data, just a point of reference, right? It doesn't, it's easy enough to provide. It's easy enough to compare ourselves in a report. Don't see any harm in providing that data.
I think maybe one thing worth mentioning too, and I think Mr. Ito mentioned this in one of the previous discussions, but it kind of depends too. It's worth looking at the perspective of the utility over time. You mentioned 10 years over like a 10 or 15-year period, and kind of where we've come from. We may all come from different places, but I can just speak to kind of where SPS was 15 years ago. We had customer number counts written on a piece of paper on a circuit. And during outage events, you're estimating what the number of, customers out was. And everybody goes into an office and paper's coming off a fax machine, and you're trying to make sense of it on a map that's on a wall. And you go from a system like that to then you implement a GIS, but you have no connectivity with your GIS, which means you may kind of know where your transformers are on the map, but whenever you get customers that call in with outages, you can't predict that back to say it's that transformer or it's that upstream fuse. You still have to do some of that manual analysis. Over time, through a number of efforts, you start getting improved connectivity, and you get to a point where probably all of us are at least at today, to where you have a fairly decent outage escalation model, where when customers call in and you get a number of calls in, you have to have those calls. For us, still, you don't have meters telling you when they're out or not, so we have to have customers letting us know. But once we get those calls coming in, then our model can predict upstream. It's a transformer, it's a fuse, it's probably this or that. It still depends on the accuracy of the connectivity model. But you do see variations within the data, just going back to Sadie and your question, over that period of time, which causes you to wonder how accurate your data was during those early years of where you were at in that journey. And so that's the thing I do think maybe all of us would struggle with a little bit, is understanding the value going too far back. Is it even accurate? I think Mr. Ito himself mentioned, with AMI, you're going to get a lot more worse system performance type data because you just have better visibility. And that's what we saw with the GIS implementation as well. So I just think, we need to kind of keep that in perspective with whatever we do.
And another comment there as well, that it seems to be that we're in a time where the technology that is potentially available on the distribution system is exceeding a pace where 10 years seems to make sense. So looking forward, as Aaron mentioned in the past, I mean, we may have things like fault location isolation equipment installed, hopefully in the next few years, where we may have some automated restoration. So that scenario that I mentioned earlier about the serviceman going out and patrolling the line, he wouldn't have to do that. The system would be intelligent enough to sense that fault. It would open a switch, it would close another switch, and it would restore what you could restore on that line. So it would still take some restoration, but ideally it would limit that to a very few number of customers, which would have then a fairly small impact to your overall system numbers. So that's the future of the distribution system. And at the rate that we're changing, basically it's just the rate of investment today, in my opinion. The technology is there. It's how quickly we can pace the the appetite to spend for that investment that's holding us back at this point.
Thank you for your comments so far. I have a few questions with respect to the outage cause code categorization. We're recommending the category codes in IEEE 1782. And then with respect to any sub cause codes, do you see value in the commission helping to define a set category of subcategories?
Well, I'll give you my opinion. I think the IEEE data categories make sense. As far as the information that's available in our various outage or work management systems, how we map to and how we train our employees and all of the things that go into driving a particular event to a certain category has a much bigger impact than our definition sitting around the table here today, right? We have looked at as part of our Texas reporting, what was defined by the field as the cause of the outage. And another point of data that we have available to us in the work management system is the weather at the time of the event. And so we've tried to correlate and map those two different things to see how much, correlation there was. So if we were to have the commission provide input there, our ability to change the culture and to change the definitions and the philosophy of how we map those things in our system, I think would be a bit of a challenge. At least for SPS, we're pretty comfortable with these codes, and they basically capture, the major reasons why you would have an outage are definitely captured within these. If you get into a further level of definition, I think you'd be capturing that, that 10 to 20%. That's kind of the least worrisome of the causes.
Okay. So actually, I have a clarification question here. Does the IEEE 1782 include different levels of categories, or is it just one level?
I'm not sure if I'm exactly understanding level.
Category, subcategory.
Subcategory, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just category.
Yeah, correct. So those that are listed, I guess we should have maybe numbered these bullet points, but towards the bottom of the document. So maybe to your point, equipment, that's pretty broad definition.
Right. So my question is like, let's say you have some extreme weather event, and then you also want to know what failed, right? So the equipment, and it failed because of the weather. Let's just say. So there are two levels there that we're discussing. And I understand that main level you're suggesting taking from IEEE 1782, that other, sub-defining level, is there a common categorization for that as well? Maybe I'm just not understanding.
Commissioner, I don't think there is. I think the definitions are fairly simple as we have in the proposal. And I don't believe, it's my understanding, I don't believe there's any subcategories or any other definition, any more detailed definition in the IEEE standard.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I do see value in having more than one level of definition, because then you could drill down further into what the cause was. And so, it might be worth if the utilities can, also discuss what another level, that way we could also have sort of a common understanding of how to categorize them. Just one thing to consider.
Maybe some commentary on that. I know it's occurred in some of the conversations as well. Very similar to P&M and what was mentioned. We have lower, more granular level detail than the IEEE standard, and so it would be a roll up for us. But to your point, we also have, I believe it's cause and also current weather type situation, to where if you have equipment failure, broken cross arm, weather was high wind or something, then, you relate those two and you go, okay, is this equipment failure or is this weather? And so I think those are the questions we all have to answer. It kind of, I think what you're getting at, what you're mentioning is how you roll these up to report them consistently on those top categories where we can do similar comparisons.
Yeah. And I think you all are in a better situation to propose what those categories should be than, than the commission proposing them initially, I think.
One other thing to mention on that, and I think we had a little discussion that maybe we didn't carry on in the subsequent meeting, but realistically, if you're looking at, system health, and I think that's one of the things that we're interested in, right? What is your system health? Blue sky days might be a good way to do that, right? Remove weather from the equation to the extent possible. Look at how your system performs on a typical, quote unquote, typical day. Because at least in my mind, that's probably a more fair representation. It takes out all of that subjectivity from the field and from whoever's entering data in a work management system. And it really drives it to what's failing and why on a day when things maybe shouldn't fail. So we did talk about that a little bit. There's probably some difficulty with that with regard to reporting mechanism, but it is something that I think in the future I would like to at least consider thinking about for an SPS perspective.
Yeah, and maybe one other thing just to mention there, even just to talk out loud on some of the same conversation that occurred in these discussions, but these are certainly very much performance, rear view mirror, reactive performance-based measures that show what happened. There's probably some additional proactive indices or indicators that could also be considered, even just back to system health, if that's what we're interested in, right? What kinds of things are you doing to improve future performance, right, based off this performance? And so, there could be things like, what kind of volumes do you run through your maintenance programs? What do your programs look like? What are your frequencies on these programs? These kinds of things, right? They could give a leading indicator instead of a lagging indicator on performance. And so, that could certainly be something to consider there as well.
And we did have a bullet points for that in the proposal. So.
Just one more. Going back to the discussion about the fewer than 10 customers on a feeder. You mentioned an idea that at first glance sounded good to me, but I'd like to get more detail because we were going kind of fast. You suggested maybe somehow providing some explanation about those outages on feeders with fewer than 10 customers. Can you explain that again?
So I don't think I was necessarily suggesting that we provide data on those individual outages, but some of the data that we're suggesting to include in the report would be a more valuable indication of as to whether or not any customers on those feeders with very few customers had issues that are worth reporting. Does that make sense? So if you're one of the 10 customers on one of those feeders, there's other metrics that we're proposing here that would show if you really had some extended outage, multiple outages as an individual customer. And I think that might be a little more valuable for those particular instances. Okay. And there's not many of them. I mean, I can say on our system off the top of my head, most of them are dedicated feeders to a customer that has a primary heater right outside the breaker. Something along those lines.
Okay, thank you.
I just have one question that I think you could answer better than P&M because you actually have experience at Texas. What the 300% number that is in the Texas rule, how did that number get decided upon? Why 300? Why not 250 or 100?
Honestly, we had one of our regulatory folks that was digging into that to try to find some meeting notes or something when that rule was created. As far as I know, they weren't able to find anything. I can't tell you. We did do a little digging into it. Again, just thinking about it generally, there's some statistical value there, right? I mean, if you think of a typical bell curve, it's going to be towards that top end of the bell curve. It probably matches up fairly closely with, at a point in time, it's 10% or it's 10 feeders or whatever that number that they were ultimately looking for was. And I don't have a whole lot of passion about where that number falls as far as whether or not we have the data available to make a good determination. I don't think we do today. We could probably pull it and try to review that to see if that 300 is the right number. But with my experience in Texas, I can say that it has the desired effect. It does point out the feeders that are abnormally bad for whatever reason. You know, SPS has been fortunate enough to be able to take care of a lot of those that were on that report for multiple years, which really did need time and attention. We're down to the point where we don't have any that are past 2 years consecutive. So we have several that hit the 2-year threshold, very, very few in the last 5 years that hit the 3-year threshold. So I think that does tell us that, you know, regardless of whatever that threshold is, if they're not showing up there consecutively, that you're investing the right way, you're responding the right way to ensure that the same customers aren't impacted in the future. If that makes sense.
I don't have any other questions, commissioners.
I have just one more question about the 2 consecutive years. Does that also come from Texas?
It does.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know that we'd want to say we want to do it just like Texas, but we think that the consecutive year approach has a lot of value. And that is to eliminate the one-off sorts of situations that it were an anomaly. I don't know the Clayton incident, but let's just pretend the Clayton incident is an anomaly. Does that happen this year? Does it happen next year? Does it happen the following year? If it's consecutively happening, it's probably something going on that we need to take care of as a utility or something, right? That's the general idea behind it anyway. And so that's why we think consecutive is important.
Yeah, I mean, it just, you know, think about it, it does make sense. You know, because you could have one-offs. I'm just wondering about the sort of duration as to how they're being considered, like if it should be a year, and a year does make sense, right? Because you have seasons, you could go through all of them. But from a customer's perspective, you know, 2 years is kind of a long time to, you know, to sort of figure out that there is a problem, not figure out, but so that's what I was trying to think about. Thank you.
And that's a good point. I think, again, and I mentioned it the first time that I attended a workshop here. We really have to think about this as a comprehensive report, though, because one thing that I'll say is, as much as we have in here and as robust as it is, if you pull out any individual metric from this, doesn't tell you the story, the holistic story of system performance. You kind of have to look at it across all of the different metrics. And again, there's a lot of nuance to an individual customer perspective, right? That gets lost. And so that's where things like for the MED days and those top 5 events that are below the MED threshold but still had a big impact. I do think there's a lot of value there to just tell a story, right, about those events. And I think that perspective, it would be missed if you're just looking at individual numbers on here. 2 years, you know, I could even argue that 2 years might not be enough time. Weather variability is a huge part of why feeders show up on the list for 1 year. You know, for 2 years, depending on what the weather pattern is, it you know, let's just say it's El Nino or La Nina, you might have the same areas that get hit 2 years in a row. The 3rd year, it's a completely different portion of your system, and those particular feeders have 0 problems for multiple years in a row. And so that natural weather variability is a big part of it, especially as you're talking, you know, P&M having a fairly large geographic footprint, those different divisions. It does have a lot to do with which feeders show up on the report.
So if we were to remove the major event days, would it make sense to maybe consider the feeders that show up after, let's say, 4 consecutive quarters?
I think I'd have to think about how you do the math on that for a minute.
Basically, I'm trying to shorten it to a year.
Yeah, and I think it's probably hard for any of us to say, especially us that geek out on data and don't want to invest in something that we haven't run the numbers on and know for sure. But I think Well, so I think speaking to major event day exclusions, I don't think we ever talked about whether we would perform exclusions at the division or more localized level versus a system-wide state or full company-wide level. What we got into very early on with PNM, our we do state level, theirs would be entire system. But that's another approach that could also have different results. I mean, on our side, I don't think we really knew that's what we were going to investigate so that we could understand that better. I mean, I think what your point is, right, is that you could have large events that impact an area, but they don't raise to a level that they would cause an exclusion on a larger area. And so it gets hidden maybe within that data, or at least that's a potential impact, potential issue, potentially something to think about. And so looking at, some consecutive period of time where, and at a lower level, that may be more visible. Again, I think sometimes too, on averages, it's just, when you really look at the data, does it pan out and does it really provide you what you think it's going to? And that's what I don't think we ever looked into enough to know whether it was going to give us additional value or not.
And another comment there, as far as the MED days, it isn't necessarily the MED days that would drive an individual feeder to meet the threshold. There could be, so again, thinking of a system as a lot of customers over a large geographic area. It could be a summer thunderstorm that hits, 5 weekends in a row in one part of your system that forces a feeder to hit the threshold. So it's not an MED day. It's not anywhere close. Matter of fact, from a system perspective, it's just a normal summer evening, right? But on that one particular feeder, it's just where it got hit. And that weather we've seen it, year after year on our system. That weather variability has a big part to play in it. So I would recommend keeping it at a longer time period. And again, for, however you want to look at a year, summers typically are our worst time. We do have those large winter storms in our area that might, meet a threshold, MED threshold, but it's really the summer, spring winds and summer thunderstorms that drive our reliability. And we have very few, if any, MED days from those events.
And that sparked a question for me is, the proposal is file a report on April 30th. But if there's some seasonality to how this works, is April 30th the right day?
So I think the intent, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the April 30th was to file the previous year's data. That gives us time to reconcile and get all the information.
Previous calendar years.
Previous calendar year, yes, sir.
Yeah, so my question is a calendar year really the right slice?
I think it works as well for us as splitting it across any other year that you might want to define. Calendar captures, all 4 seasons. It makes sense to me. I don't see any reason why we would want to change that.
Yeah, I guess if I'm trying to get the information quicker, and summer is when most of the problems happen, would it be better to go November 1st through October 31st and then get the report sooner?
I guess that depends on, what comes out of the report after we file it. So speaking from SPS's perspective, we do look at this information right after the first of the year, and we do put plans in place to address our poor performing feeders by summer in particular. If we have loaded feeders, whatever the situation is, we do put extra time and attention at the first part of the year, try to alleviate those issues from spring and summer. So our maintenance cycle falls in line with that. So if you wanted to move it up in the year, I don't think we would have a whole lot of heartburn with that. Again, not to keep harping on Texas, I think we file in February in Texas.
Yeah, and I think again, from our perspective, a lot of the discussion that we have on, the utility side anyway, in our world is we're absolutely being proactive. We're not necessarily waiting for lagging indicators to go and figure out where our problems are. We're doing everything we can to get ahead of them before they ever occur in the first place. And that's what we have tried to do. I know maybe in some of the initial discussions, trying to draw correlations between amount of maintenance work we've done versus performance. Anyway, some other things that we've tried to do there with mixed results. But We've even had high event type situation days where we know we're gonna have high winds the next couple of days. It's forecast. We live in a great world now where forecasts are pretty good. And we go send people out to go do maintenance and patrol and look for any kind of issue we could have. So we don't start fires, cause any problems, have excessive outages, you know, and I mean, even to that degree on that reactive of approach, you know, whenever game time is imminent, you know, and other preparatory, you know, kind of leading type indicators like that. So I don't know. Yeah, kind of back to, I think, I don't know that the timing is going to change our model of what we're trying to do to make our system better. And I think that's what we're interested probably in as utilities, right? Is what is it, you know, y'all are looking for so that we know what we can do, the things you want specifically, because we're doing everything we can, right? Within back to finite limits and budgets and everything else to try to maintain reliability, safety of the public, health, all that sort of things.
So we've been going for almost 2 hours at this point. I suggest we take a break if the commissioners are okay with that. And then when we come back, we can hear from El Paso, and then we'll switch gears to PNM's presentation on the Clayton outage.
Okay.
10
What
minutes.
time should we come back for the benefit of
I've got-
folks in Zoom?
I have 2:47, so you want to do 2:55?
Sure.
Okay, I have 2:56 on my watch. Is everybody ready to get started again? Okay, let's dive back in. We have yet to hear from El Paso Electric on Zoom. Their thoughts about their presentation and or their thoughts about the proposal that the joint utilities have put together. P&M, feel free to answer any of the questions that you've heard previously as well that you think might be particularly relevant.
Okay, so this is Curtis Hutchison from El Paso Electric Company. I'm the manager of regulatory case management. And also with me on the call is Jason Villanueva. He's our manager of distribution operations. He'll talk about the technical side of it and answer your technical questions. And I'll address the more regulatory and kind of reporting type questions. So I'll start off with just a few things that you've asked the other utilities to address. And the first was, I think the notification you had mentioned with PNM, and Mark Kenton had kind of hit on it, that, if we do a bill notice, that would be about $10,000 to $50,000 a year based on how big the notice is. But we could add it to the newsletter. We put the newsletter in our bills and email it to our customers. So we could let them know that, this, if you want this report, it's on our website at this location. That'd probably be the most cost efficient and effective way. I think as somebody mentioned, a lot of the newsletter or a lot of the notices just get tossed in the garbage. But we could have this report on our website annually and just keep it annually. And people have a link and they go see it and compare last year, this year, keep a running total. And then another option, it could be up to the commission. We submit the reports and the commission could keep it on their website if they want to. And maybe we also link, provide a link to where it is on the commission's website, for all the utility reports if they want to look at that. It could be another option we could look at. Another topic just touch on real quick is the SAIDI. I think somebody had mentioned like it's SAIDI divided by SAFI. That's just kind of a bad shorthand we had when you look at that line. It's SAIDI and SAFI. So we look at each feeder, SAIDI for each feeder, SAFI for each feeder. And when we look at the consecutive years, that's what we look at is, this SAIDI for these feeders for this year compared to the SAIDI for last year. And then we look at the feeders also SAFI, this year versus last year, and compare that to that 300% threshold. And this is just looking from the reporting side, not the technical side, but when you're looking at the data, that's what you're looking at. And one thing kind of to Mr. Meeks' point from SPS, when you look at the consecutive years, you may have a SAIDI that's over 300% for a feeder, but that feeder may not show up in the SAFI analysis. So there are two different type of measurements. And so they may not correlate directly. If this feeder is in the worst, it's over 300% for 1 year and 2 years in a row, but it may not even show up on the SAFI over 300%. That's happened a few times. So those are just things to consider during the report. Just a little clarifying item there. And the other is I wanted to mention on the 560 rule that we had discussed. We had discussions on this as the group, and maybe it should be looked at in relation to what we're doing with this reliability report. Maybe there is some issues that we could change the reporting on. As discussed earlier by the other utilities also, there's load growth going on. And as far as this reporting, the biggest issue, like for us when we have it, is a customer over 1 megawatt. When that person is interrupted for more than 30 minutes, that triggers the 560 rule, the 560 report. And, customers are getting bigger and bigger, and you're getting more and more customers over 1 megawatt. And, it's not related to this, but this is some of the issues that we had brought up. Maybe need to look at the 560 rule in relation to this one because of, should the size change, some of the reporting requirements change, things like that. But that's, not to divert and get off topic on that, but that's where we are there. So those are the few things I wanted to touch on, and then now I'll hand it over to Jason and he'll address a lot of the other technical issues going forward. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Jason Villanueva. And I did have quite a bit of notes here. I wanted to start off with the regions, and then not sure if you wanted me to jump into my notes or address some of your questions, but if it's okay with you, I'll just quickly give a description of our regions. So about 30% of our customers are in New Mexico, about 107,000 customers. The vast majority are in Las Cruces, New Mexico, with our service center there in Las Cruces, yard and engineering in that same area. So that's what we call our Las Cruces area. And then we have a southern area, which is south of Las Cruces, and that feeds all of our, they're basically some towns that are immediately adjacent to El Paso, Texas. Towns like Santa Teresa, Sunland Park, Anthony, Chaparral. They're very, very tied to the El Paso community as well, and Texas community. In fact, our circuits cross the state line, and we do switching across the border, and they're pretty much the same system in that region. And then our northern New Mexico region, which is north of Las Cruces, is a smaller region. It primarily feeds the Hatch area, the surrounding area. Got about one circuit that heads up that way, and one or two circuits that tie into it and feed that Hatch area. So for us, we would be breaking up our regions or districts into three: Las Cruces, North New Mexico, and South New Mexico. They are operated from a control center in Texas, El Paso, Texas, and so it's part of our same control center. But they do have a couple of small yards, one small yard in Anthony, yard, and then a larger service center in Las Cruces. But with that said, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to go down my list of notes here. I got about a dozen notes that I wanted to speak on, but would you rather me go down that list, or did you guys want to ask some questions?
Well, unfortunately, we're starting to run a little low on time. We still need to hear from P&M about Clayton. So I'll ask the commissioners if they have any specific questions they wanted to ask of El Paso Electric, and then I'll say, depending on that, how much I'll give you the floor for a few minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
So commissioners, any questions specific to El Paso Electric?
I'd say if he has things on his list that are the kind of things we've been asking questions about, if you just prioritize those, like still struggling with the arbitrariness of 10 customers on a feeder. I understand why that might be important, but I also worry that the feeder exists for a wastewater treatment plant or something, the examples we've been going through. So if Mr. Villanueva, if you could just look at your list and see if there's anything that meshes with the questions the other utilities have been getting asked, could you hit those?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Not sure if you guys can hear it too. So regarding the MED definitions, one thing that I think I just want to point out really quick that differs us a little bit from the other utilities is that we treat our system as a whole, Texas and New Mexico, when it comes to calculating the major event day threshold value. We can just as easily do New Mexico value too, right? It's not something we can't produce, but since our systems are so intertwined and the impact of a major event, whether what state it happens, does affect our operations either way. So we basically calculate our MED from that data and then apply it to New Mexico. Just something to point out there. I'm not sure if you guys caught that on the proposal. And then regarding the worst performing feeders, I know there's a lot of discussion on that, and so we started to roll out technology that allows us to track worst performing feeders throughout the year. The value is cumulative, so you can actually figure out which feeder is performing bad through the year. That way you don't wait till 2 years as you were mentioning. And more often than not, I'm sure the other utilities do the same thing too. More often than not, if you got a really bad performing feeder through the year, we're investing time and effort into it because it's getting attention, either customers or operations personnel pointing it out. And so we do proactively address our worst performing feeders. Also, critical customers, you mentioned that as far as hospitals and whatnot, and for load shedding reasons, we do identify our customers for load shedding, and as the other utilities, our customers have our hospitals do have ATSs, and we are tracking electrification. We do have some dedicated projects within operations that is tracking electrification. We do try and get a jump on our overloads, transformer overloads. We use customer data along with our GIS data. It's not perfect, but it does allow us to invest in swapping out transformers before summer hits. We actually have a pretty well developed program where we identify transformers, swap them out, and then come summertime we try to hopefully it minimizes our emergency changeouts. And we did start rolling out AMI in Texas. It's not in New Mexico yet, but obviously our practices in Texas are going to help us establish some good procedures and policies so that we can better provide customer information, can better identify issues that way too. I'm going a little fast here. I know we're short on time, but if it's okay with you, I'll jump on to a few more other topics. The CLID 4 and 8, I do know that at 4, typically an outage is about 2 to 3 hours, routinely, give or take. Some of our underground outages may last 4 for some customers because of the troubleshooting time it takes to troubleshoot an underground outage. So I do think that 4 is too low. I don't know that it kind of gets real close to the somewhat of a normal operating procedure. 8 hours is definitely something that I think is maybe we can discuss, but definitely 12 and 24 hours, that definitely is of a impact because that's when customers start to lose some of their food in the fridge. They start to lose some of their working practices. They have to get a hotel, stuff of that nature. So definitely the longer ones have more of an impact to the customers. I think 4 and 8 might be a little short, but something we can easily do if need be. And I want to speak to the blue sky data and the weather data. Really quick too, just one thing, I did want to mention that we do have subcategories or levels of codes that we use, and just like the other 2 utilities, we can easily roll them up to the IEEE standard. But in this practice, we actually did identify some room for improvement on our part. And so I don't ever recommend changing cost code practices because they do change. It does change your data. So you got to do it at the beginning of the year. That way you don't have mixed data along the year. So we do plan to change some of our practices to better align with the standard, the IEEE standard, and our cost codes come next year. For us, it won't be that big of a change. Just going to make it a little bit more better for us to align with the other utilities when it comes to weather data. Let me see here real quick on my notes. Yeah, so as far as measuring ourselves to ourselves, our self-performance, I want to reiterate what my colleagues are saying from PNM and SPS. Our practices and procedures and technology has changed dramatically, and it's going to keep on changing. So it's really hard to gauge a measure to ourselves. Actually, in Texas, we have that issue, right? Because in Texas, they hold us to a standard of 3 years from 2000. I believe it's 2000. For us, it's 2008, 9, and 10. Something along those lines. So in Texas, they're holding us to that standard, which is a really, really old performance, right? And so we do things way differently from then. And so I would say that discussion needs to be a separate workshop or something to discuss how we can gauge against ourselves, because it is something that in Texas they penalize us for, and it's something that's kind of needs to be taken into account. A lot of considerations, a lot of factors. In fact, as I think they mentioned earlier, the better you have technology, your numbers will actually, your figures will actually decrease, right? Your performance will actually decrease because you're more accurate. And we actually saw that when we implemented an OMS back in 2008. And so I do want to strongly agree with with the rest of the folks here that gauging to ourselves is something that needs some really dedicated discussions as far as how to do that appropriately. I think those are the highlights. I hate to be so brief, but I'll pause there to see if you had any questions about that or anything else.
I do not think we have any questions. I have a very quick one, and it's just a brief question. And I'm just curious, in discussing MEDs and providing context around around why those outages occurred, do you have or do you rely on mutual aid agreements with other utilities and restoration? And if you do, would you be willing to put that kind of information into a report?
We have called upon, I think we called upon PNM last year to help us with one of our major event days. And I don't personally know if we have an agreement with them. I definitely know we have a gentleman's agreement. But as far as sharing that information, I think it's not an issue.
Okay, thank you very much. We are going to move now to PNM presenting their information about the outage in Clayton, New Mexico.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just for the record, I'll introduce everyone again. This is Mike Mertz, our Vice President of New Mexico Operations, and CIO, and Wes Grayer, Director of Transmission, Distribution, and Substations. First thing I'd just say, I want to clarify, and it's in our presentation we're going to make, is we emailed this on, I think it was August 4th. We sent an email and it included all the commissioners. There's a web or a email address that we've never known exactly who it goes to. It says utility.outage.prc, and we sent it there, and I think it's recently been updated, and it went to all the commissioners. And then when we sent out the actual report, we copied who we normally do, which is the utility division director and Jack Sidler, and some of the commissioners didn't get the report, and we apologize for that. Now I understand who gets the initial email, which is the commissioners, and we'll make sure you get the report as well. But we did provide the report on time and consistent with Rule 560. So with that, we've got the presentation. Hopefully Patrick can put it up on the screen. It looks like all of you have copies. If you don't, I have a copy. Wes is going to go through it. Does anybody need copies? You want one, Mr. Ball? All the commissioners have one? Okay, go ahead, Liz.
Okay, this first slide is just it's really showing the transmission lines in the Clayton, New Mexico area. PNM is in our location in Clayton is transmission dependent on Tri-State Generation and Transmission Company for transmission service into that area. We don't own the transmission. The area is fed off of a radial 115 kV line that Tri-State brings in to their Clapham substation. It is then stepped down to 69 kV, and there's a radial 69 kV line that serves both PNM's service area in the town of Clayton itself, as well as a couple other substations which belong to Southwestern Electric Cooperative. So the outage that occurred on August 3rd impacted not only PNM's customers, but the co-op customers. But I'm gonna refer the rest of my notes to just PNM's customers and what was affected. So next slide. So August 3rd at 5:57 p.m., the town of Clayton experienced a power outage. It affected all 1,440 of PNM's customers in Clayton. And also the two, as I mentioned, Southwestern Electric Cooperative substations. There was a thunderstorm that passed through that area just to the south of Clayton, New Mexico itself. During that storm, multiple, and I've heard a couple different reports. The one piece is 5 69 kV transmission structures owned by Tri-State failed during that storm event. That's about 13.1 miles northeast of Clapham substation. So it's on that 69 kV segment. Tri-State crews were dispatched out of their regional area and responded, assessed it, and repaired the 5 structures to a point where they could restore service in just under 17 hours. The next slide talks about the reporting. You know, on August 4th, PNM submitted the preliminary report, and then August 8th, we filed the written report with all the details regarding the outage per Rule 560. And next slide. The red dot shows that approximate location. That's about 13 miles north of Clapham sub. It's as the crow flies, not quite 20 miles from the town of Clayton itself, but it occurred on Tri-State G&T 69 kV transmission line in that area. Those are single pole structures that run generally cross country. And then at that substation marked on the map of Sedan Tap, that's where that's one of the points where Southwest has their own transmission running south and picking up their Sedan substation. So, but there's two substations plus PNM's Van Buren sub in Clayton. The next slide, PNM has 4 feeders out of that Van Buren sub, and just got the general customer count and the SAIDI impacts for those 4 substations. So cumulatively for that outage on all 4 feeders, it was about almost 2.7 minutes of SAIDI time affected those customers up there.
Could I ask about that? This the SAIDI is an annual average, correct? So I'm just wondering exactly how, you know, it was calculated for this incident.
So the SAIDI calculation is the number of customers on that particular feeder times 17 hours. And then that number, and I'm not sure, I believe that is the divide, that's a system divisor. That's the impact on the system overall. So it's not a KD number. That's not the actual time they're going to see. It's the system impact from those outages by feeder.
For the whole PNM system?
Yes. Yeah, it impacts this is the impact on PNM's overall system SAIDI just from that one outage.
Okay.
So I have a question related to our previous discussion. How would this event be categorized?
This would be a transmission related outages because we lost transmission service. So it would fall into that category for us. And some of the challenges in this area, just because it's radial, just a single point of feed on both the 115 kV coming in, the 69 kV, it's problematic. You know, if Tri-State is affected by weather, then so are we, and as are multiple other customers. So it's a challenge up there because we just don't have another path to backfeed and restore service quicker if we have structures go down in this case.
So from a PNM customer point of view, is that like a N-0?
Yes.
How many more N-0s do you have out there?
There are a couple of locations in PNM service territory. The village of Ruidoso is another one of those that is served on a radial transmission feed. Again, a chunk of that transmission line is owned by Tri-State G&T as well. That line serves for us the town of Tularosa. All of this on the Tri-State side. Then it serves the village of Mescalero itself. And then we take ownership of it on the southwest corner of Ruidoso at our Hollywood substation. And then we own transmission between Hollywood and another PNM substation, Gavilan. So we own just the very tail end of it to serve our two substations in Ruidoso. But everything else from Alamogordo up is the property of Tri-State. And they operate and maintain it.
So where does Tri-State's crews come from to get to Clayton?
My understanding from the initial report that the troubleman initially we dispatched out came out of Springer, I believe. Now their crews, their outage reports did not have any detail where the crews came from.
Okay. Because I think there's another co-op in Springer, but it's not Southwest. So I guess, and this is a history point that maybe I ought to know, but how does PNM own the system in Clayton? I mean, why isn't that Southwest Electric's?
That is something I do not know, and I've worked two separate stints with PNM back in the 90s as well as now, and I've never heard of a reason how we came to acquire that property.
So the Texas, New Mexico.
That was the southern
Power, no, that was Southern.
Yeah. That was Silver City, Alamogordo, and Ruidoso came over with the merger with TNMP.
Because when I first saw this report, I was in -0, jumped out and worried that there's no alignment between, that these PNM customers are just out on an island. But it's kind of good news that Southwestern lost customers too, so at least there was some incentive beyond just being good people to get that back online as fast as it could. And then what's PNM doing to look at, like, I know we've asked this question in another forum, but there's a lot of federal money out there for microgrids or those type of investments. And it sounds like Clayton isn't alone in terms of PNM isn't in control of its ability to provide service to those towns. So what's going on there? You just pray, or I mean, is it?
No, we're just to answer the issue of federal funding. We are pursuing a number of federal funding opportunities, and we're still continuing to evaluate those that we have not yet applied for. We don't have any that I'm aware of that specifically are tailored to Clayton, but they could demonstrate capabilities that could benefit in situations like this, that could help us develop. In this case, obviously the challenge is transmission in order to fully address a situation like this as a wire solution, but we could also consider and contemplate non-wire solutions as well as we look at the evolution of battery technology and capability more regionally. So that it certainly would prove out a number of areas, although not specifically targeted at Clayton per se.
What was the load?
It's right around 5 megawatts.
Okay.
And commissioners asked, we do have several of those areas that are really fed up Ruidoso. There is a section between Albuquerque and Santa Fe, specifically it's Santo Domingo and Coche de Pueblos that are served on a radial, and a couple other miscellaneous substations in there that are served on a radial transmission line. Our Las Vegas service territory is fed from PNM owned 115 kV. There is a backup line coming into the Las Vegas area, again, owned by Tri-State, but it is not a full capacity tie. So if we needed that to rely on, we would have to go through an assessment and figure out what load we pick back up, because we can't pick up all of our load in the Las Vegas area on the backup transmission fee without overloading that and causing a bigger outage out there. So we have a few of those spots. And so it's just some of the things we're thinking about of how do we provide better reliability for those guys in the case of a transmission related outage.
Well, then, like last summer with the fires, Las Vegas was crucially important as a place where people could go. So is that a consideration when you're looking at what to do for these small communities? I mean, that's why I was like, well, I'm not sure I understand this. 10 customers or less, criteria. Because it's pretty easy to imagine in New Mexico, that one customer is important every day, but vital if something bad happens out there. And then, so if you've got the community center and then you can't provide them electricity, that's like a double problem.
In that specific instance in Las Vegas, I happened to be physically at Incident Command in Las Vegas and had met with the city manager, the Incident Command team from the Forest Service as well. And we had numerous discussions within P&M about what we were going to do and how we were going to segment load. So we activated our folks early on to try to plan of having Incident Command have the relief centers make in the hospital, make sure we maintain those. You know, one of the other concerns is the fire burned in, city of Las Vegas gets their water from up near Montezuma's Castle, which we have a radial line serving that. And we had our guys standing by ready to go up to do what we needed to do to try to maintain water service as well. So we were painfully aware of that and worked with the local officials so that, you know, we were ready to respond if needed. Luckily, the fire groups that were there managed to contain it. We actually had some fire burn under that line, but they had done some suppression efforts in there and kept it from damaging any structure, so we didn't lose power to the water facility. But it was a coordinated effort, and we will typically have people stationed in those incident command centers to talk to the emergency responders, the incident command folks, the local officials, to make sure that, you know, we're in our planning, we're not forgetting anything, and what's critical for them as well to keep service.
Thank you.
I'm curious as to whether Tri-State is or has just, you know, restored those transmission towers as they were, or whether they were considering reinforcing them to withstand higher levels of winds. Do you have any information about that?
At this time, no. We've talked internally about reaching out to Tri-State and talking to them further about that transmission line and what their plans are.
Okay.
I don't have any other questions. It doesn't look like the commissioners do either. So thank you very much for coming and presenting on that outage. We only have one agenda item left. It's a discussion of key reliability reporting issues. It's a moderated discussion. So what I would ask is that one representative from PNM and one representative from SPS join us at the table. And then, of course, somebody from El Paso Electric on the Zoom call, please be willing to jump in with answers or comments on questions. This is more of the open-ended discussion portion. We've only got about 30 minutes left in our agenda, so unfortunately, we're probably not going to be able to cover all of the topics we would want to cover. But I will start us off with outage code, outage reporting and outage code categorization. This is an area which utilities that have already highlighted as being something of importance and something that's probably needing of further examination. I personally also highlighted this before we got to this workshop today as something that needed more fleshing out, especially around methodology. So in my view, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, methodology for how you decide to build those how you decide to assign to those categories is critically important, especially if the utilities are doing it in different ways, because it means the data is open to a different kind of interpretation. If you've got a lot of unknowns, is it just because you want to be 100% certain that that outage is caused by a certain thing? Or if And, or if another utility is like, no, we don't want unknowns, we want to assign it to our best guess so that we can use that outage information later on in say, evaluating worst performing circuits. So how much does the methodology, to the extent that you guys are aware, how much does it vary between you? Is that a cause for concern? And what can or should be done about standardizing it?
I think just because of the different terrain and kind of service areas, I think there's going to be some differences in how we go about classifying those outages. We brought up an example during the call of we'll see an outage and the crews may report it as wind or trees. On a blue sky day, we don't necessarily have a vegetation related outage going on. We don't see issues with the veg. But if the wind's blowing, we see a veg related outage. And is it wind or is it the veg? You know, for us, that we would pick that methodology that will denote veg as a driver for our veg crews to go out and patrol those segments and look at them for clearing. And do we need to change the routing of a clearance crew to that area sooner rather than later based on that? That's why I think some of the information on sub causes, or at least some notes, so you have some better context of what's causing it. You know, hey, yes, there was a windstorm that day. I think Casey brought up, you know, they've got to tie to weather with some of their causes, and that adds the context and the information you need to try to evaluate what that is, because without that context, it may not mean anything. If you just see purely just veg, you got a big veg problem. You need to work on your veg management protocol, and it may not be that way because, you know, and that's just an example for us.
Yes, so I think to maybe answer your question a little bit differently, as far as how much difference there is between the utilities, I do think we talked fairly extensively about it. End of the day, I think for everybody, it's going to be a fairly subjective person in the field's decision, right? They're the ones that are assessing that outage situation, and they're the ones that are going to put the information as far as cause codes and weather of the day. So it's pretty subjective. Any kind of subjective, you know, free form data, even we've got drop down lists for different things. So you try to limit the criteria to the extent that you can. I think some of the outage codes and some of the weather data that we get is, you know, it's pretty solid data. For other things like the, you know, the other, even the utility equipment category, there's definitely not as clear cut. Just looking at our company and our folks across, you know, Carlsbad to Perryton, Texas, there's not as consistent approach to that as maybe we would like. So training, you know, make sure everybody understands what the expectations are. It's kind of a continual deal. End of the day, though, I don't know that it really would impact a whole lot. Again, for those that are a little less clear, I don't think it would impact the actions that we take with regard to our system. We're still going to do things to try to proactively address any and all situations on the system. So as an example, we have an asset health program where we go out and patrol. During that patrol, you're going to see any issues that would be, you know, utility owned equipment, right? So if you've got a more granular cause code where you break down equipment into some further category, I don't know that it's going to change the overall result, right? So short answer, it's pretty subjective. The data is always going to have some nuance that needs to be taken into account with it. The more intelligence we can get on the system as time goes on, the better we'll be at getting rid of that subjectivity, where we can tie things like the weather that's happening today with real-time outage data, and we can see those correlations. You know, we can find issues on the system more real-time again in larger events. So I don't think there's a ton of value in further defining that or even aligning. I mean, I think everybody understands that we're going to map to those cause codes as best we can with the information that's provided to us. And at least with having those IEEE codes, we'll be consistent on that aspect of it. Will there be differences? Yes, but I think there's also reason for differences, as was mentioned. You trees may be a bigger issue. Veg management is going to be a bigger issue for Wes than it will be for us. So it's going to show up as a greater cost code, whether you call it, wind or trees. At the end of the day, it's still the tree falling into the line that caused the problem, right? So if it shows up in weather, if it shows up in trees, you're still going to go address that issue. That's my opinion on it.
Yeah, and I got a quick thought on that too. I guess the answer your question, if it's a concern, I guess it depends on the perspective, right? If you're trying to be perfect and get everything lined up to the granular level, then yeah, it's a concern, right? But at the high level, I think we're all talking apples to apples. We're all going to match up to the IEEE standard. One example just to point out is on our side, we have our environmental folks. They approached us a couple of years back, and they're trying to use our outage data for environmental reports on the bird deaths, right, or bird outages. And so we used to document bird outages if the patrolman or lineman would show up and see a bunch of birds, or there was strong evidence for bird activity, we'd document it as bird. But environmental they only wanted us to do that if we found an actual dead bird. So then that changes the data a lot, right? And so I don't know how the other utilities are doing that, but that's just a simple example, the tree example, other examples. So when you get to the weeds, there's definitely going to be some differences, but I think they all roll up to some really good, solid, high level categories.
Thank you. That's I think useful information. Commissioners, feel free to jump in if you have any questions. If not, I will keep just plucking away. So while we're talking about these outage codes, I'm curious to what degree how many subcodes are we talking about? Like, is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 10? Because one of the things that I think can become problematic in these kinds of reports is if you get overwhelmed by the data. You just have too much coming in, too much granularity that you don't always need. So I'm curious if these rules were to contemplate looking for subcodes, how much data would that add to the report?
It would add some, I'll pick on equipment. Equipment is a pretty broad category. For us, we have it segmented: overhead transformer, underground transformer, overhead wire, underground primary, underground secondary, services. So yeah, you can get a lot of cost codes pretty quickly. As we stated, I think rolling that up is not going to be too onerous. Generally it's all that. We're utilizing the specificity in it to look for trends, where outage is occurring. So if we are seeing trends in underground cable failures, then it just puts the onus on us to do more digging as to year of manufacture, things that we could try to correlate to, so we can identify areas to do replacement efforts and be more intelligent about that type of work. But is it a problem adding that in the sub cause? I don't think so. We were talking about the veg issue. If we had veg and then a sub cause of wind, that'll pretty much explain what we've got going on. So it would provide plenty of clarity of what's happening.
Yeah, I'm still trying to get my mind wrapped around what our system looks like. I think it's going to depend on exactly how you map the data that you have available to you. So whether the time of the outage, the anticipated cause code, the specific, so utility owned equipment is a good example, right? If we lump everything into equipment, then that tells a story. If you want to break that down to specifically what type of equipment, then you start to add a lot of data. So depending on how many subcategories you want to try to map, it could get pretty big in a hurry, right? Because for each type of weather event that day, or let's say each IEEE cause code, you're going to have weather, and then you're going to have the different specific types of equipment as an example. So for each utility owned equipment, there's multiple weather selections that you can pick. And in each of those multiple weather selections, there's multiple specific devices that you can pick, right? So the data would get very granular, in just a couple of layers there. Personally, I think if we're going to go any deeper than IEEE, I would say weather at the time of the event would probably be the one layer that I would suggest we look at. And as an example of that, something that we've looked at before, there's a cause code of other, right? Other doesn't necessarily give a whole lot of information for anybody. If you look at only the other cause code and look at the weather the day of those causes, then you can at least make some assumptions as to what could have potentially been the issue. So a very windy day, maybe you had phases slapping together or something along those lines. So you need to go look for a span of wire that's out of sag or something along those lines. But it does give you at least some additional information to go looking for a specific cause. Anything deeper than maybe 2 layers, and I think it's going to be way too granular for the purposes of this reporting.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We have difficulty doing that internally with our own audience here when we start getting into the sub layers and what each thing means and how all that works out. So I can only imagine that if all 3 of us try to produce some data that way, it's going to be difficult. It's been a while since I've gotten into the weeds, but even when you're trying to do that internally, you run into a lot of issues just trying to make sense of it for a small audience because there's so many deviations from the top layer of cause codes.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, are you proposing here to use the primary cause and then a sub cause as well for classifications?
That was some of our discussions of trying to provide you a sub cost to give you a little more context about what was going on. Just to provide enough detail so you had an idea of some of the conditions that were going on at the time of the outage.
Yeah, I can see how it would be helpful, if one utility is saying the wind caused it and the sub cause is the tree, or another utility says it's the tree and the sub cause is the wind, you'd be able to figure it out. That seems helpful. Would there also be value in some standardizing how you're categorizing those events? Like if you would all come to an agreement, it was the tree and the wind was the sub cause, or the other way around.
I think the thing is, depending on how big the change is for a particular utility, it's the training piece. You're going to have to go in and retrain all those guys to think a little bit different. It's not something that's not doable. It's just really, it's going to be that training and getting everybody on that same page.
I agree. And again, I think when you try to get, at the end of the day, there's subjectivity to the cause determination. And so how far do we want to push that consistency? Your lineman in the field that's doing the investigation, he's going to have to make a call, right? Was it lightning? He wasn't there to physically witness the lightning hitting that device, but the evidence is there to suggest that it was lightning. Maybe for another, less experienced person, they don't see the evidence quite the same. So it gets to be hard to standardize when you're talking subjective on a lot of this. There is some of it that's pretty clear cut. There's a lot of it that's subjective for the guy in the field. And I think it's always going to be that way. And so to the extent that we can try to, align, you're still going to have to get the guys in the field to align. And end of the day, even if we train them as such, there's still that level of subjectivity there. So I guess the question I would ask is, what are we going to do with that data? What are we trying to accomplish with that data as far as the report goes? And I think that might inform the direction that we go.
Yeah, if I may add really quick, we have a document called the cause code guidelines where we train our operators and dispatchers to know how to categorize outages. And every time we change something, it's significant because it's culture change and it makes the previous data not line up with the data going forward. And it's, you got to keep track of that. You got to keep track of when you change the data, because that's an asterisk in your report. And so the more asterisks you have, it becomes convoluted as you have a lot of data and a lot of reports. And so we try and minimize significant changes in our cause coding. And so there'd have to be a really beneficial reason for it, because otherwise we just go through a lot of data. You know, it would make the data less useful to a certain degree if it wasn't really a good reason for it.
So you mentioned that you use this data for trending. And actually, this is kind of a decent segue into the next topic I wanted to talk about, which was benchmarking. So to what extent do you rely on this data to inform trends? And then what extent do you rely on those trends to inform your decisions? And should these reports not be asking necessarily for the raw data? Should they be asking for the trends?
I'll jump in there and maybe give an example to start with that answer. A number of years ago, Xcel Energy as a whole utility, not just SPS, but the peer utilities there, noticed that poles were a primary cause for outages. And again, you can debate whether the wind blew the pole down, the pole was in bad enough shape. It was a tree that caused the fall into the wires, and that knocked the pole is the end of the day the problem. If you reinforce your poles, if you strengthen your poles, if you have a robust pole replacement program, you will impact that particular cause code from being on the list. So we underwent a very robust pole replacement program, testing and replacement program. And here we are, 15 years later, and poles are now very low on our list of cause codes. So I do think trending over time, and again, speaking to the programs we have in place, which is part of the proposal here, more of a qualitative discussion on what we're doing to address system reliability holistically. I think that's much more valuable than providing, second layer outage cause code data, in my opinion. If we can tell that story and the programs that we have in place not only impacts, the trees that were falling, but the poles are getting stronger. They're more resilient against windstorms. All of those things can be accomplished in one or two programs. It doesn't really matter what the data is telling you on cause codes. The program is impacting all of those things. I think I answered your question. That's the way I would frame it.
Yeah, and for us, it's you get your reliability analysis from the previous year early in the year, and then it drives what you're going to do for the year. If you're saying veg be a high cause, and then you are mobilizing your, in my case, foresters out to patrol those areas and determine what we need to do as far as clearing, and then the veg crews follow in behind to do that clearing work. It's the same with on the line side. We'll use our performance to drive patrols. Those patrols will drive, multi-tiers of work internally. It may just be some maintenance in an area. We've got an example of wind phases slapping together. Okay, it may just be something very simple that you can go put some spacers in and you prevent that problem. It's not anything major. It's pretty simple. But then that may lead into a little bit more patrol where we have to do reinforcement. We have to replace a few structures. We have to replace some bad cross arms in an area just because of the age of the system in that area when it was constructed. But all of that drives what's going on. And again, it's the response. It's what you're doing with the data. Trends are good. But, veg may continue to be a trend, and it may just be because you're attacking veg in one area and another area's veg gets a lot more rainfall and you've got a lot more growth in that area, and all of a sudden it becomes an issue. So it's really what we do with the data on a daily basis is the big thing. I don't think trends are bad, but part of it too is understanding where those impacts are at and what are you doing with it programmatically.
For El Paso Electric, we our outage analyst probably spends half his time trending, ad hoc things that occur to operations leadership, right? What's the weekend night shift look like? What's the daytime hours look like? What is all these things that occur to us as we go through the year? And they're not really standardized reports. Our annual reports, we do them day in, day out, but a lot of and we do the usual, we invest heavily in those annual reports, right? We put a lot of attention to making sure we're addressing trends, but a lot of the trends that we address too through the year or after the year are just things that somebody just thought of on the fly. And hey, you know what? We need to check this. We need to check that. And so our outage analyst is producing trends that we don't produce every year. And that's just something that somebody operationally, maybe an annual trend highlighted something that we need to trend differently this year, just as one-off year maybe. And so it's kind of hard to rely or to say that the trends is something we can report on, because half of our trends, a lot of our work goes into just stuff that occurs through the year.
So if you're using the data and it sounds like you're using the data to inform the decisions you're making both on maintenance and on capital spend, how long does it take for those decisions to manifest themselves in the trends and in the data that you've got? And I'm expanding that question to include not just outages, but like your system averages. How long does it take between recognizing you've got a situation and then starting the process of making a decision to rectify that situation? How long will it take before you start to see the manifestation of that decision in the reports?
I think it just depends on what the reaction and that action and reaction both are against the trends that you're seeing. Some things it could take years, depending on how much investment, again, you can put into the system. And whatever the poll example that I provided a minute ago, we have something like 440,000 poles in our system. So you can only test and replace a certain percentage of those. But so long as you are taking action against it, eventually, for poles, it was probably 7, 8, 9 years before we started seeing a significant impact of that particular cause code against outages. But then it's consistently stayed below, it's stayed at the lower end of the list of causes after that point. So as long as we continue to do that, we would expect that it would remain low. Other things like an asset health program we've had in place since 2016, roughly. And if you're strictly looking at the reliability data, the way that we report it, similar to this, you wouldn't notice a great trend. But if you look at major event days, so let's just take a very strong windstorm in March of 2019, the bomb cyclone that came through. If you compared that day against a very similar day, now albeit every weather event has some differences, but if you compared that 2019 event to a similar event even early this year, we saw much less of an impact, or at least a lesser impact to the outage causes that took longer times to restore. So things like poles and cross arms. So our asset health has had an impact, even though the general reliability data might not clearly trend in such a manner that you can attribute it to that. And there's various reasons for that. Again, mainly because some of your weather events have an impact to your safety numbers that are difficult to address from a system perspective. Can't do much about lightning. Yes, you can put lightning arresters and some other things up, but at the end of the day, lightning is going to be a cause code that you have to deal with. And so, depending on the weather one year as opposed to another, the trends can tell you something, but you just, as with all of this stuff, and I've mentioned several times, you have to apply logic to it to really get to the root of whether the things that you're doing are having the impact that you intend on the system.
Yes, I would agree with Casey. In some cases on certain feeders, you may be able to do some reinforcement, and you may be able to fix some things fairly quickly, and you may see immediate results within a year. And others that you need more comprehensive work on a particular feeder, you may not see it for 2 or 3 years before the number starts trending down. just because of the time it's going to take to engineer a solution and get it into the queue and get it constructed. So it depends on really the scale and scope of what you really need to do on that feeder based on your patrols. So your trend may stay low. I mean, that's part of also the reason why we're looking at, is it underperforming for a couple of years in a row to get on a list, because it may take that much time to just manifest itself that, hey, did what we did under maintenance or under some minor reinforcement, did that have any effect?
Yeah, and I will definitely agree with you. If you're looking at feeder level, then it's much easier to spot those trends. So the impact that your program or your efforts had against that feeder, that's clear. If you're looking at it system wide, it's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The feeder level was definitely going to be more beneficial for trends. And even then, some things might not manifest themselves because other things jump into the mix that we can't help or invest for. But it's a spectrum. I think some things don't show up, other things show up right away, and there's a lot of factors involved. Trends alone. One trend alone is not enough. And Casey said this well earlier. You got to look at a few things to really interpret the benefit of your investment.
Thank you very, very much for sticking it out the entire day while we talk about this stuff. We are at time, so I'm going to turn it back over to Commissioner Ellis to close us out.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Ball. I'd like to ask Commissioners Aguilera and O'Connell if you have any remarks you'd like to make as we finish up today.
Would you like to go in there? Once again, I just want to, thank everybody for the thought that has gone into these responses. I think we continue to make progress, and I thought this was a really good discussion. So thank you all.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Again, this is third workshop. Learned a lot across those three workshops. For me, big takeaway today was that data doesn't always reveal your public interest. What you're really trying to do can get hidden in the numbers. So narrative is important. So that was really clear to me just listening to everything today. And then agenda, we're talking about discussion next steps. I agree with the idea that being crystal clear on where are we going with this would help with these decisions about where the cut lines are on what layer or level of information we're going to need. So just my 2 cents, and I think this is something I've been saying throughout, is just I'm sitting here with the regulator questions, making sure customers' money is well spent, making sure the mix on capital and O&M is correct. And then broadly, just understanding that the quality of service that's being provided by the regulated utility is sufficient for the standard of public interest. And so that's not just, is it there today, but is this money that's getting spent going to be effective in making sure it's there tomorrow? So those are the questions that I'm sitting here thinking about while I'm listening to all this stuff. Seems like next step, we need to start meshing those questions into the information we have and producing a rule, or sounds like revision to a couple rules maybe. So that'd be my 2 cents for something to think about for next steps.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank the utilities for your engagement in this topic. I think it's been another great conversation today. I do understand and agree that informing, what we ultimately decide to ask for does depend on what we're going to use that information for. And I think certainly we feel the need to be more informed. I feel the need to be more informed about reliability and to better understand how the reliability numbers feed into the investment decisions that you make. I think we all understand that we can't have perfect reliability, that's, you know, really not what we're shooting for. We do want to make sure that the public interest is served, that customers are getting adequate and reasonable reliability, and that investment funds are being well spent, and that, you know, we're not having customers with truly awful levels of reliability that are extremely unhappy. That's also a concern. So as I see it, we'll continue to have this conversation, and I agree with Chair O'Connell. I think our next step here should be that at the PRC that we aim for producing a draft rulemaking on this issue, and that you know, I would ideally like to see that in our next informal workshop we get together and we discuss that draft rulemaking. So I think we've got some work to do internally to put that together, and then we can schedule another workshop, and I think we can make some progress towards that rulemaking. At least that's how I'm thinking about it.
That makes sense to me. Again, just thank you for the information you provided. Hopefully it's been valuable time spent for you. It's certainly been for us, and we'll, I think where the value will show up is how well the draft rulemaking comes together. And I think we're on good foundation for that. I think it's my job to assess if we're ready to adjourn, and I think we are. So thank you, Mr. Ball, for being here. Also, facilitation help has been very helpful. And also thank you, Mr. O'Donnell, for getting us kicked off and the work you've done on this work too. So anyway, with that, I'd say we're adjourned.